We know that the most impacted groups are women, indigenous communities, the girls, people that have been in a favorable situation due to displacement. And these are people and groups that are facing a huge power. Can be from the state or the private sector, but there's an equality in that relationship that is not being considered in the way the public policies are defined, nor how they're financed or assured. So here comes the role of the state to think, to rethink of the dynamics, but at the same time to think about these sectors who are involved, insurance companies, legal sector, but also the banks who are behind financing, and they can understand the logics of the impact on ecosystems, on the population communities, to include another way of rethinking how to do that. It's incredible the fact that if we have some advances globally, there are certain memorandums that have been signed on the development in Africa and Asia that has to do to consider that situations of vulnerability, but not the IDB. But in Colombia, a lot of projects are being financed by the IDB. So this a responsible state could just do much more lobbying to change certain principles. But that goes to another question. From the ethics, what are the principles that we have to consider to avoid or impact the least as possible? Because one thing has to be clear: displacement by development are on a high. There's even more every day due to the fact that we need much more energy, food to feed these urban well, the people in general. But the question is, how can we improve that and do it differently? The role of the state, the complex role of the state, as you said, you talk about the IDB, that in the last Summit of the Americas was defined to create much more relations in the region. Doctora, you are also in a place in political control. What is in the case of urban development? Because Medellin is like a very important city in that development aspect. What is the impact that that's going to generate in the communities? Communities that have inhabited Medellin due to armed displacement, due to forced displacement. How do you analyze that? Well, I think there are several things we have to analyze. First of all, is the political context. In the political context, I developed the political control with um, partnerships with the people. So we reduce that a little bit of that political control. We have to name that. It's not that it's not important to renew the urban, but the urban renewal, the public works, and with all that risk management, it's very important to consider all the access. If we don't consider all the access, the affected people will going to suffer. I think I did a follow-up to the tram, and there were people during 8 years without having a solution for their houses. So when we have these development, if there's not a council who's going to do a control, well, the public works is going to be very interesting, but there are a lot of displaced people. So here, there's a lot of women in poverty, and it's going to create much more feminization to poverty. There are some damages in the fact that the territorial context is not considered. We're the only ones we voted as no during the fact to do the subway of La Ochenta. But we didn't have any guarantee for the neighborhoods. Uh, Afterwards, we would say we have a policy of neighborhoods very well. But if inside the project we do not have a clear budget so that people can be relocated, if that budget is not very clear, well, we are doing the things badly. So what the state has to guarantee is a consultation processes. We know that in previous consultation is only for the indigenous peoples and ethnic groups, but it would be interesting to have these real processes because not only say look at this project, it's incredible, but there's not really an area for for the participation of people. How do they want to see their neighborhood, how that neighborhood is going to articulate with that development, and because it's going to generate displacement of victims that are direct and indirect, because they're going to be left aside. So the role of the state should be much more, let's say, should negotiate and protect the guarantee of a of rule of law. In our constitution says we can participate in the decisions that affect us. So to listen permanently, to open those spaces, it would be very important to negotiate something that's not going to be negotiated by the state. That would be the model, development model. That would be a political topic that we have to debate. What is the model development that we have? We have innovation, marketing, a city. We are a science and innovation district and technology that can generate other types of displacement. But we haven't had that debate. What does that imply and what is going to be the effects for the citizens?
Sí, mañana tendremos un debate en el
Yes, we'll have a debate in the council about inhabitant policies in several cases of some council people. We're also there, and we have been following some of those affectations through the inhabitant policies. And yesterday, and these days that we were with affected communities by development, we had a conversation, and Mrs. Juana from San Luis, a neighborhood, said, I've been struggling for 8 years so that I can have some of my rights guaranteed. And a leader of the neighborhood Naranjal says, I've been struggling for 20 years. Oxfam talks about the corporate capture of the state, and you mentioned that before. So, what kind of freedom does the state has in order to guarantee rights? And second, how can we get closer through ethics? Sometimes people would say development doesn't have ethics, but how to have this approach of ethics to these phenomena? Well, those are difficult questions to answer. I'll try to answer. So we need to know that this topic or this issue of reparation, even it's fundamental, it's not everything. It doesn't cover everything. It's just one part of trying or treating displaced people differently, but we need to understand the logics of this reparation, and which is exactly what you mentioned, which takes a long time to waste for many reasons. In the dam of Guatemala, this took 30 years to just carry out some investigation. Later, there were so many complications due to armed forces, different interests. So first, We really need to identify what has happened in an almost forensic way, and which takes a long time. And in the meantime, where those projects have financed, oftentimes they can blame each other. They can play around with times, deadlines. They can change credit modality. State says, well, we have nothing to do with this, and we don't have the resources to really give a reparation. And and sometimes we the enough. And that has to do with this issue of time and the lack of planning, of good planning, having a real accompaniment that can allow us to take people's situations into account. And in the literature, there's references to that, the lack of political willingness. We talk about the weakness of institutions. We see the lack of a good planning. So those are some of the reasons that can contribute to situations we've been talking about. But as you said, this is a more structural issue that has to do with power dynamics in general. And we are in a world where corporate power stands out more than the state's power or even the power that comes from the informal economy, like the case of Mexico. We're not talking about formal enterprises, but we're talking about non-traditional types of economies. So it is very, very difficult to think about this differently, to think about a different treatment. But this reinforces the role of thinking about it, thinking about different ethic possibilities, and to see which actors can contribute. And as I said before, there's some progress, some, for example, comments from the European, uh, the UN Human Rights Commission in social and economic social rights that highlights the displacements of people should only be exceptions under very strict law. And the state is still responsible not only of protecting the rights of the people, but also to amplify the scope of their actions. And that's when we talk about tax taxes and other policies. So from an ethical standpoint, I think it is also important to make progress and to leave this paradigm, this utilitarian paradigm behind. That says we could sacrifice people for the well-being of the nation, or of everybody, or almost everybody, because there was a part that was sacrificed. So we need to really question that idea. And that's what we've been working on for many years of invalidate those arguments. And besides that, we need to abandon ideas of what we call the benefit sharing, which meaning people who were benefited by displacement of others, they need to pay something to those, to the victims. In that way, there is some kind of balance between those two groups. But even though that is applied in many instances, and the World Bank has been very important in this regard, there's a little empiric evidence that shows that it has really worked. What I would suggest is an approach that was developed in the 90s, but it was not it, it was not very considered from someone called Samuel Shepard, who talked about the idea of what he calls the distributive hybrid, which is this idea that you can mix an ontologic approach with other approaches, that which means that people who are in worse situations of more poverty, more marginalization, their situation and their uh, needs, well, their needs have more importance than those of who will benefit. And we need to consider both of those populations and respect those demands to the extent that the full outcome says that we'll reach less than the increase of well-being of a group, of the bigger group. So thinking about a limit to respect situations of those who have less. And I think that's so important because from an ethical point of view seeks to mix those approaches, but also because we think about this relationship of how, what is the real meaning of one's life to another, to other people, and there we can start a conversation or to really talk about a problem, have meetings with those people with a different point of view around the benefits of only economic development, for example. And there's really a way of thinking about the world that could be different in it, that could be more important. And we've talked about this before because this allows us to really value the process and not just the outcome, not just the final outcome of the process. And in that encounter of really asking people about their situation, we'll get to another process, another procedure of building public policy, for example, or projects for on displacement, and as we said in the Commission of Social and Cultural Rights, only in exceptional cases. And what's happening in the world, well, in the corporate world and probably less democratic, is exactly the opposite. There's a lack of control, and there's a big danger of not taking into account the relationships between different groups. Perfect. Endora. As, as for tools, what tools are left for the communities and for those who have been affected, which have been many people? There are small groups in many places, but that adds up, and we have a lot of people who are marginalized. So, in your experience, what do you think about the protection through legal or political assistance? Well, I'll start from the general aspect. So, first, this is a cliche, but it is so important to know who we're going to vote for because they're the decision makers. And if you see the panorama, we did a study on the voting. So how some sectors of Medellin, some neighborhoods vote in Medellin, who they choose, and then how represented do they feel afterwards. And we don't have a match there in the peripheral areas. People vote for certain political parties who go there, and their development model is completely opposite to the poor people. So there we have the first fracture, which is how to have political activism and vote, and how to vote well. Second, I think it is very important in terms of political control to have Medellin has, or in some areas, in some sectors, I'm talking about the Pacific region, in the neighborhood called El Pacifico, we have some very qualified people. We have lawyers, engineers, etc. And there's a community discussion that is very, very important, very qualified, that needs to be in a conversation with decision makers. And it's not easy. And I would invite you to do two things. We need to move forward in terms of strategic litigation which is not reduced to legal action, but has to do with political activism, social mobilization, and it is necessary for this work. There are some universities who have legal clinics or political offices. And because we're talking about such long term actions, sometimes this is not as effective as it could be. But we need to start to combine to talk about litigation, which I think is important, that are actually urgent in terms of, we're talking about life or precautionary measures as well, and that we can connect this to legal issues that could be covered in the long term, but also in terms of political activism. And we can see that we could have some influence in the decision making process. Sometimes talking about ethics, many times or oftentimes actions are legal, but they lack ethics. And then we say, well, if we have a legal issue, well, I can fight for it because I'm a lawyer, but there are some other elements that go beyond beyond the legal aspect. And we see a lack of ethics there. And then we would have to have help from the media that sometimes are not very useful. Because if the media had some kind of independence, I say this because I wanted to take actions in different ways, but there are some other interests on other levels, and we really can't have the impact that we would like to. For example, we were in in the project for the stadium, the renovations of the stadium, and in the parking area. So in this renovation, strangely, they had been there for 40 years, and there is a contract. We were working on this for a year and a half. People there were formalized through the contract, and there is a contract later with the signature that with a company that was selling food, and then these people were left out by this contract. And then we see that the renovation is about to start, and these people from the small business close to the parking lot were not being taken into account. So there, the ethical aspect should be valued. There were people who were struggling after the pandemic. They were working next to the stadium, and now they have no jobs. So there are big discussions that we would like to have to cover. But for example, for the media, this type of case is just not interesting. And we're talking about 40 families, most of them elderly, from the elders and people with disabilities. So we should be talking about this from administrative or through administrative morality. We're talking about privatization of the city. So what is left? What are the tools we have left so that communities can defend themselves? From my experience, what is left is mobilization and grassroots uh, mobilization. But that could be difficult. So what is left? What can we do there? Yes, as you mentioned, as you said before, oftentimes we're talking about communities that are highly marginalized, fighting against big powers. And we see this unequal relationship that is so deep, and the only way is through mobilizations, grassroots mobilizations, and to really try to find international support as well. But as you said, is very deep and legal issue, and is maybe we could open law programs because, well, yes, there are many lawyers in the world who are really also fighting, who have been recognizing the situations in which communities cannot really expect anything from the state, and that have to face or to fight against this big monster differently, and they need legal support, and they need lawyers who have a different vision, who have different trainings, and who are capable of talking about these principles and ethical ideas in different ways, so we can create more a legal and ethical code and legal application in a different manner. And that's urgent, I think, not only in Latin America, but all around the world. We're talking about the critical legal solution in this matter. In this, Julie, with the creativity of movements, mobilization, I think that's the only way to go. Unless, because of a miracle or a better coordination process, there could be a way of institutionalizing those demands from the victims at a Latin American level, for example, something where we can really find direct reparations or remedies through appropriate channels for these purposes. But this could be in the long run. Dora, in the same sense, what is left in for communities and organizations? What can be done? Well, I think what is left is an interdisciplinary union. I trust the social mobilization, and I insist there's a very important sector in Medellin, the grassroots movements, what that needs someone or the decision makers. They don't need to institutionalize the movement. That would be a failure, but they would need to receive those demands and make it happen, because that we're talking about political willingness. And we've been talking for about 2.5 years, and we say that everything's political willingness, and it's a matter of how much pressure we can apply. And there's people at the inside exercising political control, and jointly with the university, strategic litigation, that some legal offices are very important, because there's a lot of very interesting mobilization on public opinion. I think those demands and social mobilization is strong. It could be very powerful. We just need to keep demand. Public works have what we quote unquote the social officer, which had nothing to do with being with society. But on the other hand, we have the community created because there's no strategic litigation, but also taking into account decision makers who can really take those, receive those demands. That's very important, because decisions are being made or being taken with without any balance. So we need to close those gaps that we have in terms of decision making.
En las investigaciones que hemos realizado,
Yes, even in research that we've carried out, we find that those actions are not very balanced. And what we can see according to the data is that they they go to lies, and at the end we have a criminality in the territory, and apparently we need capacity building in organizations in order to fight against this. And before going to questions from the audience, so the world is changing, but is changing within the same system, within the capitalism. So we're generating wars in the name of capitalism, and we're taking confrontations to the limit. So what analysis can we do there in ethical terms? Were we surpassed by reality? Well, I have always defended the idea that what's ethical is what's positive or what's good, but what's ethical could be seen in what is the worst, maybe ethics of evil, but from different other principles, rational principles, with ideas of efficiency, efficacy that exists in what's good and in the evil. I think in we can find ethical principles that are applied even in the context of war, and to some extent there's some kind of fight with many nuances of what kind of ethical principles and applications of ethics are happening in the world. From this point of view, I think we have this plurality in what we call capitalism. There are different types of capitalism that are fighting against each other. We can think about the typical corporate context with a bad boss, bad intentions, or the cryptocurrency phenomena. Maybe they have a similar logic, but there are different ways of carrying these ethical principles out. And well, the world is changing. We have increasingly more conflicts. We have climate change. And I think what we see is in reality is that we're going back to ethics, of talking about ethics, and to ask questions like why? What do we want? What is the meaning of well-being? And Dora was talking about development. So what's the use? How and why? And I think that's already very evident. We're seeing changes happening in the global north at an individual level. We see what kind of products do I buy, what kind of transportation do I take, and I think that's the use of ethics. When we think, what kind of principles do I follow? How can we put this into practice? And there we have some legal, political, economic apparatus that can lead us different ways. In That's the question: what kind of well-being, what kind of life and relationships, with ecosystems do we want? I think that's a key question, and I think the role of politics and policies should be asking publicly this type of questions, and take those answers into account. I think this really reinforces the attention to this question. And Dora, having a good life, vivir sabroso, should be another ethical proposal to face this drama. I agree. I think questioning what is unquestionable is the way to go, is the way to move forward. Because if we legitimize the patriarchy, capitalism, we're going nowhere. We need to be in a constant dispute, a constant questioning. Is a symbolic dispute of recognizing other ways of life. I think what has happened with this new Eurocentric capitalist patriarchal models is that they set unquestionable standards that seem unquestionable. So what I think is we need to have good lives, and we need to really go back to the basics, which has generated other types of lives. And always, we should always question those topics that are quote unquote unquestionable. Yes, development is seen as a religion. sometimes. Let's move on to the questions from the audience. Are there any questions or comments?
We are left highly impacted.
Sí, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Sí, es un tema bien interesante,
This is a
como
very
decía.
interesting topic.
Eh, Usted, señora concejal, pues conoce muy bien
You, as
los
a
procesos que se
councilwoman,
arrancan
you know the processes
en el Consejo,
ongoing in the council.
fundamentalmente la formulación del plan de ordenamiento territorial
Let's say the
y toda una
urban
serie
planning
de
and
acciones asociadas a
other
ello.
types of actions
Y desde luego el
associated,
equilibrio de
and
derechos y
also
deberes
the
es
balance
fundamental.
between rights and duties.
El tema
So,
pues, es un pacto, es exactamente cuando estamos hablando de
when we
proyectos y de
talk
pactos,
about
es el proceso típico
agreements,
de
pacts, it's the, let's say it's
concertación entre el
the
Estado,
typical
la
one
ciudad,
between the state,
sindicatos,
the
empresarios y la
city, the private
población,
sector,
que
and population.
afortunadamente
But
se suele
unfortunately,
adelantar y culminar en forma de
it
desequilibrio.
ends in a
Hay unos
disbalance
poderes
because there are
que
several
prevalecen sobre los
powers
otros, pero
that
desde luego es muy
um,
particular y
are
yo
heavier. So
personalmente
I
la
know there's
movilización
certain
ciudadana
elements, let's say
tiene
citizen
instancias
mobilization.
complementarias y mecanismos disciplinarios
That sometimes these
que deben
mobilizations arrive to
optimizar
the
el
courts, but we
resentimiento
have
directo
to
a través de
see how
acciones
they are
jurídicas,
dignified
porque
through the legal system.
en los consejos
Because in the
son
city
muchos
council,
intereses
there are many
cruzados que hay,
crossed
muchas
interests,
veces
and many
el resultado
times
no es
the
el óptimo.
result is not the best one.
Que estoy totalmente de acuerdo.
Yes, I do agree with you.
Sí, porque incluso
Yes,
la disputa,
because
por eso
the
digo,
debate,
no,
that's why
todas las conversaciones son muy
in
políticas,
every conversation, they
porque
are
yo en este
so
momento soy la minoría,
political
tengo la
conversations.
minoría. Entonces es bien
I,
difícil que
it's
mi
very
solución
difficult because I am part of the
acorde
majority
con otro
and
tema.
represent the
Y eso
minority.
habría
So
que, yo
we,
creo mucho en la
I do
movilización
think, I
social,
do
creo
believe
que
in social
se puede
mobilization, and I
impactar
think
y que
it
hay
can
que
make an
generar
impact.
otros
And we have
espacios
to create other
incluso de
spaces
liderar, que
to
es lo que falta mucho,
show.
porque hay veces
We are
la
lacking that
política se
because
vuelve
many times
políticamente correcta
politics
como
is
si todo el mundo es amigo y lo que hay que
politically correct and
son
everybody is
otros
friends. So we
intereses
have to
que
really
siempre
show the
permanecen
underlying
ahí y que
interests.
no es un solo voto,
Those
sino
underlying interests, not
que
only
detrás de
one
eso hay
vote, but
muchísimos
behind
intereses y
that,
creo que
there are a
debería
lot
haber también
of
una
interests. So we have to
posibilidad de
make them
ir
visible
construyendo
in
otros
order to
espacios.
build
Sí,
other
toda la
types of
manera,
discourse.
este tema de la formulación
Yes,
de pactos
and
alrededor de
these
los reconocimientos del sector,
formulation of
desde luego
agreements,
responde a la lectura del
is
momento
an
y un contexto
answer to the moment and
político
the
actual,
context.
de
I
las
was
dos
part
que
of the
convocaron.
agreement
La negociación se hizo con
777 with
con la
Kamakol
Sociedad de Arquitectos.
and the
Hoy en día el
Architecture
sector
Society.
político
Now,
ya
today,
no tiene la
it's
legitimidad de la
impossible
negociación
not to
como elemento esencial de
imagine
la
having that
discusión relativa
conversation during
y que
discussions.
pues la
So
Constitución del
it has to
91
be in the Constitution of
todos los
91, and
instrumentos
we
de
have
participación
all the
ciudadana, creo
instruments
que
in
deberemos
citizen
buscarlos,
participation. So we had
fortalecerlos
to
y en estas
strengthen
discusiones pues
those
ambas
instruments.
cosas.
And I think we're on the right path.
Bien. Nueva
Another
pregunta,
question,
comentario.
comment?
Sí, dale. Bueno, como no hay mucha
Since there
pregunta,
are no many questions, I
puedo
would
decir,
like to just say one other thing that we have to have it very clear. When we talk about
todo lo que hemos hablado, ¿no? No atendía bien
to treat as the displaced need, not the planning, that large process to demand the rights. We are reproducing vulnerability conditions, producing and reproducing. That is a component that is intergenerational. It's going to affect every generation. And at the end, it has to do with social status, gender, ethnicity, and everything we talked about. But the problem is with that vulnerability that we create and reproduce every time, we are all going to lose in the long run faced with the climate change because It's going to impact those that are much more vulnerable, but it's going to impact us all. So we are all in a situation of high vulnerability, as we see it globally. And in Colombia is very aware of that. And many times we have to make that condition very clear. I would like to make a self-promotion. I have the last book. It's about Ecuador after the problem that we had in Ecuador after the earthquake and how to create incidents based on other logics, other points of view. So you have the book available if you want to read.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your insights and your experience. I'm not sure if it's all my own problem or subjective. And I have felt like in a, let's say, in a great space because I'm listening about ethics, but I really don't understand in what terms, concept, what ethics are you referring to? Because uh, in Johannes' intervention, you mentioned the fact that ethics can be used for evil. And I do agree there are different justifications of ethics, utilitarist, deontological, ethics of pleasure, deliberative ethics, as Habermas, that justifies the types of action generated. I understand ethics based on that old perspective, like a limit for action, human action, because if the human action doesn't have some limits, and if the politicians do not have limits, well, that classic uh, thinking will lead us to tragedy because when we are faced with a model, capitalistic model focused on economic growth, the problem is that it's illimited. It's the idea of producing for producing, consuming for consuming, more efficiency, more productivity, more richness, and at the end, more for what? More for more. Tomorrow, uh, that was mentioned. Behind that, there's some instruments that lacks the idea of asking ourselves, what is really the objective? So I am a bit lost when you mention ethics and ethics. That word, so sometimes it's broadly used, supposing that everybody's going to understand what it means and that there's a solution. But I haven't seen that. As I said, I'm not sure it's my problem for the interpretation I'm having of what you have just said, or or other things happening. But to end my question, because you're going to talk about development and displacement. We know that the majority of people displaced in Colombia is due to armed conflict, due to violence. I come from a city where I work is Cartagena. We have an internal displacement. It's called gentrification. When I arrived 25 years ago in Cartagena, those who lived in the neighborhood of La Boquilla, they were very, very poor. It's still very poor in their surroundings, but they have been displaced, and in their place, they have built buildings like Miami, and they are still living like in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. In Cartagena, we can jump from Miami to Africa with those images that we see every day. But my question goes to how do you see, what do you think that development model that is hegemonic has been imposed that in Colombia is displaced by violence with the topic of peace. We could rephrase it. How to change that development model and how to articulate it with a peace project. That seems to be taken with this no new road, this new path with certain hope and optimism, because it's a change, it's a shift in the power in Colombia. We are in an inflection point, an historical moment, because this didn't happen for 200 years. This didn't happen that an internal force had control, had the power, and could lead that roadmap of Colombia in terms of what Francia Marquez said is vivir sabroso, living happy without the possibility of having fear and having a wonderful life. And some media try to present it like not giving the credit she deserves. So, how can we articulate a proposal of a different development to that development that displaces, that is violence, not a direct violence, but structural violence with peace? How do we articulate that? It's still an unmet promise in the Colombian society, but we are bringing it back. But since the Constitution 1991, we had that illusion, but it's not been materialized up to date. That was my question. There are several things. As you mentioned, we're in an inflection point. The current government really didn't consider the disaster of corruption with the peace money. So it's a very important moment to really consider the implementation of these peace agreements. Talking about the context of Medellin, we are not pedet because not all the municipalities are going to have the development plan, the urban development plan. We are not pedet, but it can enable other dialogue possibilities. I insist we have to question the economic model and development models because what we have been imposed is just one model. And under that model, the state has made it legal, the economic guilds have made it legal. And do we have to question is that the only model or different ways that are important to guarantee? In the movements here in Medellin, for example, they talk about a lot of pieces, not only one piece. Going to think, talking about uh, Paulo Murillo in the 1800s, but with these peace speeches, they have made disasters. So we have to see how these peace agreements can really impact the local and affect other memories. We are doing a project here in Medellin on memories of the armed conflict. Those memories have that possibility to remember the effects that the Orion operation had on the city as a result of an exception state of the President Alvaro Uribe, and what happened in Comuna 13 that you're going to visit on Saturday. So this is going to be a project that half of the city council is not happy because we have to put in context the local. So that topic of the different pieces, but other models that are not hegemonic, but are there. So what leads us to the fact of living happy is to listen to those voices, other ways of governing. I think it's going to create a huge possibility. The Ministry of Environment, Susana Mohamed, the new minister, She was being asked on fracking. So it was putting uh, this discussion in another way, but she's going to be able to debate at the same level, not because the economic groups surpass the state. And sometimes there are negotiations, international negotiations, but at least there's going to be a voice saying that we have other opportunities. We have different points of view, not only the armed conflict generated displacement, but when what happens with the displacement, with uh, with what's happening inside the family. There are a lot of displacements. It's not only based on armed conflict, but I think we have to create these spaces in the academia. And tomorrow we're going to talk about that in the city council. There is a displacement due to an imposed development model.
Sí, muy de acuerdo. Muchas gracias.
Yes,
Muchas
I do
gracias.
agree. Thank you very much for your question. I
Importante.
think it's very important.
Primero, pues lo nebuloso de la ética. Y la
Talking about
ética, para
ethics,
mí, y
for me,
coincido con muchos
ethics, and I
acá,
agree with
es una
many of you,
forma de
is a
hacer visible
way of
las
making
consecuencias o los
visible
posibles,
the
eh,
consequences
digamos, opciones que
or
pueden
the
existir
options
para
that can exist
mejor estimar,
to
mejor decidir entre lo bueno y lo
to
malo.
decide between
Y saber
good and
entonces a
bad
dónde dirigirnos.
and where to
Porque sí,
continue.
tenemos una cierta direccionalidad.
It has certain
Evito
orientation.
un poco la
I
palabra evaluar,
avoid
porque evaluar
the word
normalmente
to
desde
evaluate
una perspectiva
because it may
objetiva, ¿no?
have
Como
a
ver atrás
posterior
de
overview
ahí decidir si puede ir bueno o mal. Y muchas veces lo
many
entendemos
times.
por la situación, digamos, donde la ética tiene papel, nos pone en
The
tiempo
role of the
adelante
ethics makes
y
us
la
make the
existencia sucede en el fondo
decisions,
y dentro de eso pueden emerger
let's
múltiples
say,
maneras de concebir tal vez
posterior wise. So I think we have
o
many
opciones,
ways to
justamente
consider and many
mencionaste la
views.
deontología,
You
o el
mentioned
humanitarismo,
deontology.
hay formas otras de ver realmente al
I
individuo, a
think
grupos,
there are
a
different ways
individuos
of seeing the individual,
agregados
not
al
only the
espíritu,
groups to say if
todo
it's
eso
good or
puede
bad.
existir,
That can coexist,
y es
definitely.
importante,
But it's
y
important.
creo que
And
como vuelvo un poco a lo que se ha dicho antes, es tan importante preguntarse
it's very important to
muchísimas
ask
veces
ourselves
si
many
realmente eso
times
tiene sentido,
if
si
this
está bien
makes
aterrizar
sense
esos
to
principios
review
en los cuales estoy
those
siguiendo, esas
principles I'm
guías y cómo
following,
evalúo
those
lo bueno o malo.
ideas. How do I evaluate the
Y voy a
good
volver
and
a
the
esto.
bad?
Ahora la segunda parte.
Now,
¿Qué tipo de paz,
what
¿no? Es
type of
necesario.
peace would be the
Creo que
second answer?
es, digamos, alrededor del mundo hay muchos centros
Around
de
the
estudios
world,
sobre
there
la
are
paz.
a
Creo
lot of
que lo que tienen en común es que no
study
se los dan
centers on
los
peace.
datos simplemente
And the
afuera, que tienen
peace
que
is
ver
not
con la
something
referencia a
that
las
is
víctimas,
outside saying who are the victims,
los que han causado la
who
destrucción, la
caused
violencia,
the
todo eso es
destruction and violence.
sobre
No,
todo con una mirada interna.
I think
¿No?
it's
Interna
an
realmente
internal
psicológica
view,
muy profunda que
psychological
puede
view,
hacer
very
para
deep
llevar una paz
psychological
en
view
uno mismo
to
y
achieve
desde
a
ahí
peace from
construir un
within.
paz en la sociedad.
And
Una
from
paz
then on,
realmente,
create
digamos,
a peace
integral que
in the
no incluye
society
menos
Hi,
that has to do with international levels too.
hi, can you hear me?
How
desde
can the
Colombia,
world
Can
learn
you
from
hear me?
Colombia? For example, we
países
were mentioning
más
that
allá de
yesterday
para prevenir conflictos
to
cercanos
prevent
en América del Sur y
conflicts
también en
of
otros lugares.
in other
¿Por qué?
places of
Porque
the
no
world.
podemos hablar
I
de las
think it's very
conexiones
important
a nivel
question. There has to be a connection. There are
continental
other
y ese
levels. There are
conflicto también
interests
sigue,
globally that that
¿no? Y
conflict
aterrizar esa
will
conexiones
remain
hasta lo más
here,
local, hasta lo más
Say it
regional,
again.
from the individual
global.
to that global
Entonces, la
connection.
paz en ese sentido tiene mucho que ver con
Peace
eso,
in
con
that
el
sense has to
bienestar,
do with the
el bienestar
question
al
of
final
well-being, individual
de los
well-being
grupos, de las ciudades, de las comunidades, etcétera. Esa pregunta
of the
entonces ya para
communities,
mí
of
hay
the
un
cities.
espíritu
That
también
is a
circularizante.
question to
¿Qué
build
bienestar?
principles of
¿De qué
ethics.
manera?
Well-being
Por
for
eso
who?
mencioné antes
How?
este híbrido
That's why I mentioned that
distributivo
the
de género,
distributed
que habla
hybrid
justamente de esa
that
idea de
talks
que
about the idea
las exigencias
of
tecnológicas
the
que tengan menos
demands who
serán
those
tan
who have
respetados
less should be
que
as
incluso lleguen
respected
a
that the
alcanzable
well-being
para todos sea,
is
digamos,
achievable
nivelado hacia
for all
abajo para dar espacio y
downward
acceso a los
to
que
give
generan
space to
menos
those
tienen
who have
exigencias
less and who
muy,
have
muy, muy importantes,
very important
que debemos tomar en
demands.
cuenta.
that we have to consider as a principle, but also to create a well-being for the majority of the people in that sense of giving respect to that relationship with those who have less and who have more.
El bienestar está como la gran
Well-being
pregunta.
is the
¿Qué
key
bienestar,
question.
qué bienestar para quién? Lo más
Well-being for
necesario,
who?
más adentro, que los
From
más afectados por
those who
temas de
are more
desplazamiento, por
affected
temas
due
de
to displacement,
violencia
for
intrafamiliar.
violence
Hay una conexión,
inside the family.
sabemos muy
And
bien,
there is a
la
connection
violencia intrafamiliar
among
y
the
por
violence
ejemplo
in the
el tema
family
de votar
and the
por
taste for
políticos
just
más autoritarios.
voting for
También
authoritative
sana esos
political
más
figures.
autoritarios, no solamente hacia otros, sino también
So
hacia el entorno
also to
ecosistema.
the ecosystems, considering the ecosystems, it's a way to impose, to conquer, to destroy. It has to do a lot
Violencia
with
intrafamiliar, que
that
es un
violence
hecho
in the family.
empíricamente investigado.
It has been investigated, it has been
Y no está
researched.
en
So we have to talk
temas
about that well
donde
being as an
las estadísticas
integral
se vuelven
point of
cruciales.
view. That's why the ethical
Y
topics
esa
are so
pregunta
important.
de
That
qué y para
question of
qué, qué modo de
what,
desarrollo es muy
how,
importante.
what development
Tal
model is
como hemos
important.
vivido en Ecuador,
Because as we lived in Ecuador,
se lanzó en 2008
a new government in
esa pregunta, esa
2008,
cuestión, esa inflexión grande, histórica de cambiar todo,
with
en
that
muchos
desire of
países
changing
lamentablemente
everything,
se volvió cada vez más autoritario,
it
cada
became
vez
very
no
authoritative,
escuchando esa idea
not
de
listening to the
razonamiento
idea
preguntar con
of
fines
ask
medidos
how to
y
really
muestran
achieve those
lamentablemente
objectives. And
muchos
unfortunately,
desastres.
there's a
Y
lot of
por eso
disasters in
esta
Ecuador. So
llamada a cada vez
that's the idea
más
to
abierto a
really
preguntar las
be
preguntas qué somos y
open
para qué,
and
qué
ask the
manera, cómo
question,
llegamos a esos fines
why, how
para
can we achieve
mantener
those
abierta
goals to
esa
maintain that plural
posibilidad
idea
sin
of
caer en
well-being and to
trampas,
not
estas
be
trampas que alguien o
trapped
alguna persona o algún,
that
digamos, misionario puede
any
dominar
missionary
para los demás.
can
Eso
just
sería lo
impose for the others.
ideal horizontal.
That's, I think, that the historical error. That would be the one.
Bien, yo creo que vamos
Very well.
cerrando
I think we are wrapping
y
up,
creo que tengo
and
algunas
I
I
wonder,
think we have
can
very
you hear
broad
me?
analysis routes to
Can,
question development like a religious and
hay
faith
que
topic.
cuestionar
We
también
have to
cada vez
question
que
also
bajo
the
ese modelo
m-
generado también del norte
model
como modelo asiático
generated
y que
from
podemos
the
vivir de
north,
otras maneras.
because we
¿No?
really can live in a
Entiendo
different
y
way. I
creo que
understand
en
and
el
I
sur
see that
también
in
se
the
dan
south,
respuestas a
there are
las
many
convocatorias que
um,
hoy nos están
responses to the crisis that
a
we
esta
see in
convocatoria que ya
a
estamos con
civil
que nos
crisis
lleva al borde de
that
la
is
guerra
going to lead
por hambre
us to
y
a
creo que
war.
tendríamos que
So
mirar
we have
más hacia
to
nosotros mismos. Por
really
eso insisto que es
see
bien sabroso recibir
within
también
to live
respuestas
okay
desde lados éticos
uh,
del sur, desde América,
with those
donde
ideas
no se
from the
trata de
south
las lógicas
that
comunitarias,
we have in our
donde sí
communities.
hay muchas respuestas
Many of
ya
the
dadas
answers
a
are
esos problemas
given
globales.
to those
Entonces
global
cerramos
problems.
por hoy
Very well,
y
so we will
sobre
wrap
todo
up,
no sin
and
también decirles
I would like to
que
say
el informe de la Comisión
that
de la Verdad
the
también deja una
Truth
serie
Commission
de
report
análisis
also
muy
leads
sobre cómo el desarrollo
to some
ha
analysis.
provocado guerras
So, in the
y
fact
todo
that this
esto
development has
en el
generated
Pacífico, ¿no?
wars.
Hay un análisis muy
In the
sabroso
Pacific,
sobre
there's a
cobre,
huge dispute
los sectores
on
que mueven
copper.
ese sector
So
norte,
there
los
are
jugadores económicos
actors in the
que nunca se
north,
tocan
but
y nunca se quitan la mano del plato.
they
Son
really do not, they
relaciones
never
asuntos.
uh,
Ahí está la
use
Comisión
their
de la Verdad
hands
y desde donde estamos
to touch
observando
that blood they are
la cosa.
creating. So
Muchas gracias.
thank
Muy
you very
buenas
much for
tardes.
your attention.
Bueno, agradecemos mucho a
Thank you very much,
Dora,
Dora,
Alfonso, a
Alfonso,
Johannes por esta
Johannes,
conversación
with
y
this
vamos a
panel,
continuar
and we will
con
continue
una conversación que hemos esperado mucho, la conversación con
with
Karina Batthyany.
a conversation with Karina
Invitamos a
Batthyany.
Karina a que nos acompañe aquí.
Please, Karina.
Bueno, muy bien. Quiero presentarles a Karina
I would like to
Batthyany.
introduce Karina
No la
Batthyany.
conocen, es una mujer con quien hemos
She
compartido
is
muchos
a
escenarios en
woman
América
with
Latina
which we
y
have
también
shared a lot
muchos
of scenarios in Latin
desafíos,
America, many
proyectos,
challenges, projects,
sueños de
dreams
transformación en el escenario
of the
académico y
transformation of the
fundamentalmente en
academia
el campo de las ciencias
in
sociales.
social sciences specifically.
Karina es una mujer que
Karina
está al frente de
is a
Claxo. Bueno, voy
woman
a contar
that
a
leading Claxo
continuación, pues ha liderado muchos proyectos
has led many
interesantes
projects,
para
very
las
interesting
ciencias
projects
sociales,
for
empezando con la
social
renovación
sciences
de muchas
with
de
the
las
renewal
epistemes
of many
que
of the
durante muchos
epistems that
años
for a
hemos
long time we
utilizado
have
como
used
horizonte de
as
investigación.
horizon for the
Karina es
investigation.
socióloga
She is a
formada en
sociologist
su doctorado
with
también
a
en sociología
PhD
en
in
Francia,
sociology in
es
France. She
profesora
is a
de la
professor
UDELAR
of
en
the
Uruguay
UDELAR in Uruguay
y ha sido
and has been
recientemente nombrada
recently
nuevamente
named
para otro periodo
for
como
another
directora
period of time
ejecutiva del
as
Consejo
executive
Latinoamericano de
director of the
Ciencias Sociales,
social
CLACSO,
sciences,
que
CLACSO,
es, digámoslo, no solamente la América
not
Latina,
only in
sino
America,
en el sur
Latin
global y
America,
hoy
but in
con
global
conexiones con
south,
el
today with
mundo
connections all over the world.
entero, una de las plataformas
It's
más
one of the
importantes
most
para el
important
pensamiento
platforms
crítico
for the
y
critical thinking.
digamos, adelantándonos un poco a lo que esperamos que nos va a
She
contar,
is going to
ha
share a
sido
lot
una
of things, but
plataforma muy
this platform
interesante
has been
para
very
debatir,
interesting to
para
debate,
tensionar los
to
modelos de
think about the
desarrollo
development
que hemos
models
concebido
that we
siempre como
have
modelos
thought
hegemónicos,
about as
patriarcales,
patriarchal,
fascistas de alguna manera.
hegemonic,
Y bueno,
fascists
hoy
in a
nos
way.
alegramos
So we
muchísimo
are
de
very
tenerla a
happy to
Karina en
have
Medellín, de
Karina here
tenerla
in
en el
Medellin,
espacio
to
y
have
de
her in this
poder
space, and
tensionar
to
a través de la
really,
categoría
through the
de
category
cuidado,
of
de
taking
políticas,
care,
liderado
the
específicamente
politics
por
of
la
taking care,
categoría de desarrollo.
to talk
Ella
about
va a
the
hacer la
category of
intervención
development.
inicial
She is
en
going
la que nos va a
to
hablar de las
talk
políticas de
about
cuidado como
the
dimensión
politics of
central del
care
desarrollo.
as a
Vamos a
focus of
escucharla en una
development.
primera parte y luego pues
And
obviamente vamos a
afterwards,
hacerle algunas
we're going
preguntas y a
to
conversar con
ask
ella.
her some
Karina,
questions.
bienvenida, qué rico
Karina,
tenerte por
welcome.
aquí
It's a pleasure
y
to have you
te
here with
escucho.
us. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias,
Thank
antes
you
de
very
nuestra
much for your
presentación.
generous presentation.
Buenas tardes
Well, good
a
afternoon to
todos y
you
a
all.
todas. Realmente es un gusto estar
It's a
aquí.
pleasure
Quiero
to be
agradecer a
here. I would
IDEA, a la
like to
Universidad de
thank
Antioquia y
IDEA,
a
Universidad de
UNAULA,
Antioquia,
la
UNAULA, the
posibilidad de
possibility
estar
of
aquí.
being here
Y
today.
en este
And
momento en
this moment in
Colombia,
time
tan
in
significativo,
Colombia that
tan
is so
representativa y
important with so much
esperanzador y
expectations and
positivo
so
no
much
solo para
hope
este país,
for
sino
this
que para
country,
toda la región
but for the rest of the region too,
latinoamericana y caribeña.
of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Durante la
So
conferencia de
during the
Claxo, hubo un
conference of
evento
Glaxo in
hace un mes
Mexico 1 month
aproximadamente,
ago,
Eduardo que estaba por allí,
Eduardo
exactamente hace un mes,
was
estábamos
there, and
todos expectantes de lo que
we
iba a
were
pasar aquí.
expecting what
eh,
was going
en
to
Colombia
happen here in
y
Colombia.
cuando conocimos los
And when
resultados,
we saw the results,
puedo asegurar
I
que
can
toda
assure
América
you that
Latina, todo
all
el
Latin
Consejo
America,
Latinoamericano de
all
Ciencias Sociales
the
se
Social
gozó
Science
y
Council
festejó esos
was
resultados.
very happy with the
Miramos con
results.
mucha
And
expectativa y
we
por
see with
eso
much
siempre es un gusto
expectation.
estar
So it's
aquí
a
hoy,
pleasure to be in
en el
Colombia
marco
in this in this political
proceso político
context,
que se
in this
abre ya en
political
pocos días.
process.
Bueno, ya se abrió, pero
Well,
que
it's
comienza en
already
pocos días.
beginning, well, in a few days.
Es
So
maravilloso.
this
Estamos
is
muy
wonderful. This is
resentidos
wonderful to be
y
here.
queremos apoyar
Without a
el
doubt,
vivir
we
sabroso,
want to
¿verdad?
support that
Es
vivir
una
sabroso,
expresión
to
maravillosa que
live
hemos
joyfully. So,
en el panel
what was
anterior.
being discussed in the previous panel.
Como decía recién, yo voy a intentar
As
colocar uno de
she
los
mentioned,
temas,
I'm going
el
to
del
try to talk
cuidado como un
about
elemento
the care as an
central
element,
para el
focal element
desarrollo.
for
Para el
development.
desarrollo, por
For
supuesto, en la
development,
perspectiva o en
based on
la
a
clave
perspective or
latinoamericana
in
y
the key
caribeña.
of Latin America and the
Sabemos
Caribbean.
que en nuestra
We know
región
that in our
la
region,
temática de la desigualdad de
inequality,
género
gender inequality
es absolutamente
is
estructural en
completely
todas nuestras
structural
sociedades.
in
Por
all our
supuesto, en
societies.
Latinoamérica en general,
Inequality
esto es
in
así
general is
históricamente.
structural in Latin America
La desigualdad
historically,
de género
but
que tiene
gender
algunas
inequality that has
características
certain
particulares
characteristics
es también
is
parte
also
de esa
part
estructura.
of that
Y
structure.
justamente algunas de esas
And
características
some of
es que
those
se han
characteristics have
invisibilizado
been
algunas
not
dimensiones
visibilized.
asociadas al
Uh,
desarrollo y algunas
some
dimensiones
dimensions
asociadas a
associated to
bienestar
development and
como se
some to
discutía
well
en la
being,
mesa
as
anterior,
being discussed in
al
previous panel.
bienestar
To
tanto
the
en
well
el nivel
being
individual
on the
como
individual
en sus
level
niveles
and
agregados a
as
nivel de lo
in
que es
its
el
added
bienestar social
levels as well
como
be
concepto.
social well
Y
being
una
as
de
a
esas
concept.
dimensiones
One of those
invisibilizadas
dimensions that has
dentro
not been
de esa
visibilized
desigualdad
in that
estructural
structural
de América
inequality in
Latina
Latin
es la
America
dimensión del cuidado.
is the dimension of care. All the studies in our region, in all the countries, with no exception, show that due to care, through care are the critical nodes of gender inequality and social inequality in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And the category behind that, you all know, is the sexual division of labor and how from that division of labor, a structural category for us who study gender and for us who work from a feminist perspective, how from that sexual division of labor, the social organization of care is given, the one that we have today in Latin American societies, and how that care, how division of care is articulated with other dimensions of development and in general at the social level. That's what I intend to talk about today and hope it is going to be that a conversation, not a monologue. So, and first of all, I want to say that we have to remember what has happened in the past 2 years during the pandemic. I think we're bored talking about the pandemic, but we have to give the analytical weight it requires, this phenomena requires during the past 2 years, and the crisis that it has created in our region, in the world, and in a region that has certain characteristics. Just to mention a few, remember that one third of the deaths due to COVID 19 were in Latin America and the Caribbean, when more or less we are 8%, less than 9% of the world population. That talks about that crisis that without a doubt began, uh, it was only on the health sector. It was presented as a health crisis, but it acquired the role of a social crisis, an economic crisis. This crisis of COVID 19, from my point of view, made it clear the need to redirect or rediscuss the social relationships. You were talking about agreements, pacts. We could talk about it in that terms, and also the relationship with nature, putting on the focal point three fundamental notions: interdependency, the notion of care, and sustainability. These are three key words to think towards the future, the development of our societies, or at least to think about the development of Latin American Caribbean. As I mentioned, the shock that was caused by the pandemic change shifted from one day to the other. Let's say from 2020, everything changed from our dynamics in our work, in our families, in the dynamics of care too, and the recovery that we are starting to see from 2021 to this crisis, that it hasn't to be seen like a conjunctural crisis, it's systemic crisis integrated to the crisis process that Latin America was going through. That recovery that is very weak, still very weak in our region, and completely asymmetric. When and we know what we mean when we talk about asymmetry in Latin America and Caribbean. So we do believe it is consolidating the disbalance, social disbalance, and gender disbalance. In 2020, some were talking about the possibility to revert social processes, social relationships, etc., due to the shock caused by the pandemic. We are seeing that it's going in the opposite direction, that these recovery processes, always talking about the region, in reality, they're deepening the social inequalities and gender inequalities. The indicators, the numbers that we are seeing in 2022 with data from 2021 and 2020 show that reality. This implies for those who work in the social science field that we should rethink our priorities in academia, in our agenda, research agenda, to really rethink the central nodes for our region, but at the same time to rethink of the priorities, not from the point of view of the academia, but from the citizens' point of view, being the citizens, individuals, that we are, because we're immersed in a society, and how can we rethink that social contract? And for me, care is fundamental. Let us rethink that social contract, putting care in the center of the agenda. Again, in the center of the agenda, from the micro levels, our micro negotiations, daily micro negotiations, that sometimes we did not give the enough value to them, up to the care in the center, let's say in the center of the public agenda, living joyfully, or what Colombia is rethinking today, faced with this new process. Without a doubt,
I think the issue of care has a very important place in terms of the debate and the public policies proposal in social sciences in Latin America and in the Caribbean. Obviously, this is a debate that surpasses or exceeds Latin America. And if we want to go and look for the origins of the idea of care, we go to the 70s, and the first references go back to the French in English literature. But we could say that in our region, from the year 2000, this is a topic that has been incorporated in the academic agenda and in the academic debate. And in more recently, just 5 years ago, we started to incorporate this in the public agendas of Latin American governments. Actually, there's a first element that we see, and is that every country, almost with no exception, from the Latin American region have been incorporating the topic of care in their public agendas. Obviously, with all the diversity that we have in our region, in many in a more active way, others more in a more shy way, maybe at a national level or local level, Colombia included in that process. This could be an example with the experiences they have been developing in different Colombian cities in this regard. So, care, as I said, this started to be seen in the public agenda in Latin America in the framework of discussions on health policies, education policies, protection, social protection policies in a broader sense, and in terms of social security. Today, we could say this is a key dimension for the analysis and research on development policies in Latin America and on social protection policies, and that we could, if you want to do the exercise of analyzing which has been the progress of our countries in this regard, the main progress in the normative framework, and what I mentioned recently, that this topic seems to be, from an analytical standpoint, seems to be out of the private realm to go to the public realm. So now this is a problem that people solve with their own means. And when we say this is just a reproduction circle of inequalities and tensions. And when this becomes a collective issue, this requires more public policies that can treat this issue. And there we have to also recognize the importance of gender studies, feminisms, and the contribution they've had in this topic so that this can be talked about and can be shown as a key aspect for the economic and social systems, and at the same time as a key element, a pillar for well-being. And here I connected with your previous discussion in the panel on what kind of well-being we're talking about, what categories of well-being at an individual and social level we're talking about. Obviously, when we talk about care, this is a derivative of other concept in the social theory, but this is linked to reproductive work, non-remunerated works or jobs, until this becomes another concept in the social theory. But also we want this to be an object for the empirical field and research field, as well as for the as well for public policy. And obviously most of these concepts are subject of debate and are in constant construction. And well, there are many definitions and possible approximations. Maybe some of the ones we're talking about today in Latin America in the field of development and public policy have to do with understanding care as an action of helping a child or a dependent person in their development and their well-being in their daily life. And obviously this broad, very broad definition has to do with material dimensions, the work of care. We have all taken care of someone. So the specific activities of taking care of someone, but also another economic dimensions that are related to the direct or indirect cost of these activities. And a third dimension, which is very important, associated to the issue of to psychology, the emotional side of what it implies to have a bond that we establish and sentimental emotional bond between the person who's taking care of a person or the collectives who are taking care of someone. So that relationship generates a bond. Another very key element when talking about care is having in mind that this is relational, which means we establish a bond between the two parties. And also we could find other types of relationships that are derivative of that. So we need to understand care as the element that provides well-being and development, and that has to do with what the physical, emotional aspect throughout the whole, through our lives as human beings. So we need to understand this notion of interdependency. We don't, we're not born as caregivers. All of us throughout our lives will be taking care of people or being taken care of throughout our lives, depending on where we are in life. And so this notion of interdependency, it seems to be very important. Also, there are practices in our regions in Latin America. So care can be done in two ways, especially with paid or non-paid work. And this could happen in two contexts. Obviously, I'm just simplifying this. First, indoors or indoors meaning the family or outside of it, outside of the household. And the nature of care obviously will change depending on if it's within our families, if we're paying someone to do this, etc. So that's how we can start to build different approximations, different approaches to categories for analysis. So this is in a ongoing development, obviously, also in relationship with the development of public policies that are taking place in our region, meaning the exercises of taking this to the public policy realm. So maybe one of the first elements to analyze here is understanding this, the power of the idea of care, and how in this idea we can articulate some debates around development, for example. So we're talking especially about this topic today, around some debates and some agendas that were previously very dispersed. We're talking about children, the elderly, agendas for people with disabilities, development agendas. So when we place care in when we put it on the table, maybe we can gather elements from all of those agendas, those debates that were pretty much scattered. I would also like to talk about this notion of the organization, social organization of care, and how this happens in Latin America, because I think that is through this characterization of that we can ask ourselves how to create transformation. So when we talk about Latin America, and I do it all the time, and I make this mistake all the time, but I'm aware of this mistake, and that's the first step. We're talking about a region that is very diverse, and that indeed we could have to say in Latin America, we would have to mention those particular characteristics, product of our diversity. But obviously, those differences, and you know this, you have been talking about this. You've been talking about economic structures, social structures, family structures, which are very diverse that we have in our region. So when we see this social organization of care, taking diversity into account, we find elements that are common to all our countries, regardless whether we're talking about Colombia or Haiti or Uruguay or any other Latin American country. Uruguay is my country, but I can mention any other in the region. And beyond some exercises, because they're just public policy and care exercises that want to transform the social organization of care, that organization remains to be familiaristic, meaning that the ones who are taking care of others are the families. This happens in Latin America. So families, another category that could be controversial, especially for the feminist movement, saying the family could be controversial. We need to see what's happening inside families. You have great exercises about families, family structures. You use different tools such as surveys, and we go and see what's happening within the families. So obviously, the ones who are taking care of others are women from different generations, but it's mostly in 80% of the cases, women take care of others within families. And the same thing happens in other countries. So care happens from the female side of the family in our countries. That's a first element. Second, mainly it's a non-paid work. They don't receive any compensation for this. And thirdly, so services that we find outside of the household of the family have two characteristics. They could be um, there could be mercantile services or public services of low quality and low coverage services, very focalized to a certain type of population. So that's why we said it was this care was essentially private in the framework of families, and it's also done by women. So when this is not the case? What's the second way in which we can find in a region in terms of care? So we see paid work, domestic paid work. So we have the people who, in certain social levels, of course, have this role within households. I don't have to say that besides this, well, there are big characteristics when you start to think about other dimensions and other variables such as the social economic level. mm, There we can have some other particular features that I'm not going to mention for time reasons. But as I said, we need to place in this analysis what has happened with the pandemic, and what happened didn't really modify this situation that I just mentioned around the structures of care, but what happened is that it deepened these dynamics. And when those who work on this topic, we had some little hope that the pandemic could be useful to change these dynamics because, well, men and women were in their uh, we're home supposedly with the same possibilities to take care of their children or other members of the family. Maybe there could have been a chance to divide this work, but unfortunately, all the data, including data for Colombia, we had a survey made by a group recently, shows that this sexual division of work didn't really change. It was just deepened. I know many of you are not from Colombia, but since we are in Colombia, I'm talking about this country. So what happened in the pandemic here and in the rest of the countries in Latin America is that more time was spent by women in Colombia. 1 hour, 1 additional hour during the pandemic was assigned to taking care of others. And what happened to men? Well, nothing really happened from this point of view. Meaning, I always like to use this, such as the electrocardiogram. We see this model when we're talking about women and the time they assign to taking care of others. We see an electrocardiogram because the time we assign to taking care of others changes depending on if we have children, how many children we have, their ages, if we're caregivers of other people, of elderly elders or people with disabilities, if we live in urban areas, rural areas, if we have or not the resources, and any other variable that you can add. The electrocardiogram for women is quite vital and quite diverse in terms of time. The one for men is as an electrocardiogram for a dead person. Not even the pandemic was able to move them to do something differently. Not even the pandemic made men do more or assign more time to take care of others. That's why I always say that it's just an electrocardiogram of a dead person, whether they have more children, less children, more money, less money, etc. Nothing really changes. It's not like they don't take care of others, but it's just it's very little, and it doesn't represent a lot. And this also happened during the pandemic. So this crisis of care that we had already been experiencing in Latin America was exacerbated by the overload that women had during the pandemic. And I won't give you all the statistics that I wanted to share with you from CEPAL, but you can look them up. You can find them in their website. But this exacerbation, which is differential depending on the group we're talking about, obviously the most complicated cases were those women in more affected sectors by the pandemic, affected economic sectors, women in reproductive age, people with a lot of children in rural areas, and we could go deeper into those numbers later on. after 2 years of a pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, what do we want to present or and talk about it in the framework of this Congress? So, how to build an agenda on care, putting care at the center, at the core of this agenda, because the only positive externality of this perspective that we analyzed from the pandemic is that we gave visibility to care. So the strongest person that had that person's electrocardiogram, well, found this problem all of a sudden because obviously dynamics in the household were modified from day one of the pandemic. So this issue of care basically exploded at all levels, at a micro level in the household, but also at other levels in all different countries, etc. So this seems to be the time now that we have visibility and we can talk about an agenda that places care at the core and that it can do this directly. So, how to build new ways of organization, social organization of care that have a real impact in the general organization that we have as societies by placing the care at the core and displacing something that seems to be key, which is displacing the market, such something that dictates our lives. So the market really dictates our lives, whether we like it or not, at all levels. It dictates from the individual level to the common or collective life, if we could call it that way. So there in that challenge, we have once again to go back to those words that I mentioned at the beginning. So interdependence, relational question, and understanding that we need at least to work on the idea that we should recognize, redistribute, and give another type of value to care. Maybe the recognition in giving new values to care could be taken as an positive externality of the pandemic, but we cannot just stick to that. We need to redistribute this, meaning at the micro level, from the sexual division of work and the dynamics we have between females and males in our social groups, but at the same time, and that's our challenge for public policies among agents who provide um, care. And these are with a very important role, the state, which has a responsibility. The state has a responsibility at different levels, obviously families, communities, and the market. So it's there where we have this articulations or this dynamics at a social level. And we need measures that can really break traditional molds, schemes that we are used to, so that the solution is not that women and girls are always taking care of others. We can think about compensation and social compensation for this type of activity, especially during crisis, which is when we normally seek that unpaid female work in their different versions. So we should redistribute, give new value, and reformulate care, taking into account a public policy that places care at the core. And for this, this goes hand in hand necessarily with a cultural transformation. This is not just about presenting what I just talked about. When we say placing care at the core, this means placing life and care at the center, displacing other topics such as the market And this implies a deep cultural transformation. And it implies, and we shouldn't forget, this questioning to the sexual division of work and the gender systems that prevail in our Latin American societies that are still, even if we want to hide it, are very deeply patriarchal in their development, daily development. Some elements of what we learn from experiences in Latin America, as I said, some of them are at the local level, some others at the national level, the one from Uruguay that I mentioned, but also we measure them in terms of scope. So understanding that as the concept of care is in ongoing construction, the concept of public policies are in on their first steps in Latin America. Maybe somewhere else in the world there could be a longer tradition in this sense. But first, we need to understand the key role that the state should have when we talk about care policies. You maybe some of you might say, well, in the South, we say that if we're talking about public policy, we're giving a role to the state, a central role to the state. But when we talk about care policies, we might forget that when we are called to have a role, um, we only blame the state. And this is a topic that integrates the public agenda, social public agenda of the states, of the governments. So after the evidence showed that I said the care is a critical knot of society, if we work on care policies will have an impact on those critical knots of inequality, and therefore we will move forward to well, better, more just societies in from a gender standpoint. Then we identify a need when we talk about care policies of rethinking about public policies, at least those or some public policies by sectors. Because as I said at the beginning, care reunites scattered agendas. So talking about care without talking about health policies or talking about education policies or policies that are linked to social security is completely impossible. And most importantly, talking about care without talking about economic policies or tax agreements for care policies is completely impossible. If you think about moving forward in terms of care policies without talking about these other topics, and especially in terms of taxes and policy, well, they won't be able to move to have to make a lot of progress, and that's happened previously. And also, we need to say that we know that care policies reach the public agenda hand in hand with the idea of gender and feminism. We need to be careful when we're moving forward in terms of care policies. We shouldn't forget about feminism and gender. Since, as we did before, when domestic violence policies or family violence policies reached public agendas hand in hand with gender and feminism, and in some countries, when 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 they implemented the first policies that would take care of those problems, we forgot about gender, we forgot about feminism, and sometimes the solution was not the most appropriate one. So we should be careful of not forgetting that feminine or feminist and gender perspective. And thirdly, we should keep in mind we're talking about rights. We have the right to work, to health, and we also have the right to care. And this means universal policies. And when we're talking about universal policies, we're talking about policies for everybody, not just for one sector, not just for the poor, not just for the most vulnerable, or for those who have more needs of care, but policies that have an universal reach or scope. And this should be also in the formulation of policies. So what we are presenting is since international organisms, many of them are promoting the discussion about new social pacts and new social contracts. Well, I think we should place at the center of these discussions and contracts, we should place the issue of care as a key and core element in order to move forward to more equal societies, not formal equalities, which is one of the problems we're facing in Latin America. Oftentimes, we remain in the formalities of it, but we don't go to the implementation phases in our daily lives and in our daily spaces. So that's why, once again, talking about solidarity, interdependency, and care as a key core element in the discussion that will take place in the region, and hopefully in the discussions for this process, political process in Colombia, we should be placing a core at the center of living joyfully. Thank you.
Bueno, muy bien, vamos a abrir el espacio.
Very well. Thank you very much. Does anybody have a question? Let us begin a discussion with Karina. Somebody would like to ask a question?
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Karina, for your intervention. The concepts that you have talked about, the implication it has. I'm not sure if the question I'm going to ask is pertinent. I think it's important to just think about it, just ponder. I haven't deepened uh, my insights in that topic because care is associated, and I've heard about care. That's what I've heard. But you talk about the chauvinism, the imaginary, patriarchal imaginary. And I always associated care with the woman in the family. And in the university, also in the studies in nursery and health studies. I some think somebody wrote a thesis about care in the elderly people, in the elderly centers. So I was thinking out loud, what is the richness of that category? If that category is has a chauvinistic connotation and is patriarchal. So my question is, uh, shouldn't we have to build it? I'm not sure if I'm clear enough. Should we build it? What is the richness for a person like me that doesn't know about that category of care? And if is it linked to those imaginary chauvinisms and patriarchal concepts? Why insist in it? Why shouldn't we just build it from scratch? Thank you very much for your reflection or your question. Well, first of all, as a category or concept, if you go back in time, what you're just saying wasn't mentioned as care, but moreover, the fact that the term of time, we give the importance of care as a focal element for life. Without care, there's no life. Without the care of different types. You were mentioning, for example, those elderly, but in general, if people do not receive the care they need, what is at risk is life itself. The category is not patriarchal nor chauvinistic. What it is the practice of care. And these are the ones that we should change, modify. We cannot eliminate care because it's vital for life, and we acknowledge that the importance. But we want to change the practices. The practices of care are chauvinistic and patriarchal. The practices of care are the ones who give the women the fact that we have to take care. We were born with that chip, and you were born without that chip. The impossibility of learning to care or caring, which is not the truth. So, this is what we want to change, showing that it's a joint responsibility from the women and men, and that we all, the same as we do other things in our daily life, in a social life, we should get involved in care. It's not the care, the concept of care. We have to change the practice. That practice supported on the sexual division of labor that in Latin America are completely deepened in that social division of labor and in the family that makes the women to be in charge of absolutely everything around care. They're in charge, and during their vital cycle, because first of all they take care of children, then brothers and sisters, then they take care of mothers and fathers, neighbors. So the continuum of care in the women's life is permanent, and it's an absent dimension in the lives of men. That's what we want to change for many reasons, because it's a gender inequality node, and also because the men need to understand the value it has from the point of view of the social, economic, and effective aspect. So to grant them the possibility for them to participate. That's what we want to change. Karina, I would like to take advantage of this moment to ask you several questions. One which has to do with the dimension of the category of care. Could we think today that care is condition of shift? Let's say the is it possible? Because when we talk about care, there are many dimensions that it will affect. Obviously, the economic dimension, that is maybe the one that generates more resistance due to the fact that you were mentioned to think about care to the guarantee of rights. It implies to think about a redistribution of care. It implies to organize the political actions, legal actions, and social actions as well. But because that shift, what I call a shift of care, it reaches many aspects, like the one we have today in Colombia, to live with joy, vivir sabroso, the good living, ethics of life that Francisco was mentioning yesterday, and that it has in core very interesting categories: deceleration, maybe, to think about also decentralization of the market as an only possibility of relationship and existence in capitalism, but also that shift faced, that shift that we have to really rethink the academic agendas. Yesterday, we had the first draft was launched, the first draft on science, technology, and innovation of this new government of living with joy. We hope that the formulation behind science, technology, and innovation is much more associated with a possibility on transformation of the communities, and from the communities what they feel they need, and not, as Dora said, that development models really um, they install deeply in the territories. Is it possible in the terms of this care that with this tradition it has acquired, are we in a moment where where care is going to change? There's a shift, and what's going to be the relationship of the academia with the state, the government, the society, the private sector that really enables this transformation? I know I'm making a very complex question. Now, what does that to live in joy, that mode is going to transform education, the environment, how is it going to transform the model and the extractivism that we've had in Colombia? Is it possible that this is an alternative to respond to these huge problems we have today? Well, that was a huge question. Well, I have several answers, and yes. The first yes is it is a shift. It is one of the most innovative shifts that bring much more challenge in the social science arena. Why in the social science field? Because it will affect the daily life. And in that sense, it's going to affect everything as a wave. It's shift, or maybe a rupture in methodological terms, the idea of placing care in the center, as it was mentioned by many others, as the society of care. It may be an opposition to the market society that we have so deeply incord in this region. If we see the studies of gender and feminism, is to re-evaluate a very old idea of feminism. So to place that idea that at the moment meant and accompanied so many transformations that if we see in hindsight, they were not as visualized. And to just to bring it back and to put it in the center, in the core, with a shift, as you said. Yes, the personal is political, but moreover, the lesson learned of this pandemic that left us is that we have to give the political dimension of the daily life. So to place that political dimension, so then on we can build new relationships, new contracts, and many other things. So there's also a dimension that I didn't mention here because I was really talking about care among the people. It has to do with the dimension of care towards the environment. When we talk about care today, and when we talk about the society of care, we have also that view of placing the individual on the core, but also we have to take into account the care of environment. They cannot be um, separated. They go hand in hand. This implies many challenges for those who are in the academia, for those who are in the government, and also challenges for the social organizations and movements uh, for the creating those agendas, social agendas. And what's more important, obviously, the agenda is very important and mobilization is important. But due to that mobilization, the most important thing is citizen control of the monitoring. I don't like to talk about control. I like to talk about monitoring to public policies and to that agenda that builds social organizations. There's no separation because why the academia? Because and social organizations in our region, they go hand in hand, they work hand in hand. Feminism could be an example of that. The universities, mm, I could say, are all feminists. Not all feminists, but really they go hand in hand. It's not a definition. It's are they are working hand in hand, the universities and these movements. So we see a process that is very interesting. In summary, that shift is just to move that axis of the market as a regulatory axis. Today, we're citizens. Nevertheless, we're consumers at the same time. Many of our rights are highly associated to the consumption, to the possibility of participating or not of that market. So we have to move that axis and place care of life and of the environment in the core. So I do think there is a shift and implies a an epistemologic rupture that is very strong and implies a transformation in that political dimensions of the daily life. That is the core.
Hola, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a la profe Karina por su excelente exposición. El tema del cuidado es un tema que hay que tener cuidado. Eh, la profesora Cortina habla también de esta temática, se llama ética cosmopolita, y pues menciona algo sobre esto, como cuidar la palabra. Y el tema de la interdependencia. Inclusive ella dice, ¿cuándo vamos a celebrar el Día de la Interdependencia? Siempre celebramos el Día de la Independencia del país, de la independencia de Colombia, la independencia de cualquier país, siempre se celebra eso, pero nunca se celebra el Día de la Interdependencia. Qué bueno planear esas celebraciones. Y sobre esto del cuidado, pues me interesa como preguntarle, yo estoy tratando de construir una categoría conceptual que se llama cuidado cívico. El cuidado cívico, pues pienso yo que trasciende ese cuidado de persona a persona. El cuidado cívico hace referencia en cuidar la democracia, en cuidar la palabra. Por ejemplo, los medios de comunicación juegan un papel importante en ese cuidado de la palabra. Entonces mi pregunta es, si cuidamos la democracia, ¿cree usted que se fortalecen los demás cuidados? Yo no creo que en una dictadura exista cuidado, o a manera como lo vea el dictador. Yo creo que la esencia del cuidado va en el cuidado de la democracia. No sé usted cómo piensa, si cuidamos la democracia, o sea, la democracia no es una persona, la democracia es una forma política, una forma de gobierno, la menos mala de todas. Sí, yo creo que aparece, aparece la acción de reconocimiento, porque es en la democracia donde se pueda dar un verdadero sentido y esencia al cuidado. Muchas gracias.
Sí, gracias. Estoy de acuerdo con lo que plantea y también, digamos, en la medida que está interesado en este tema y quiere crear esa categoría, le recomiendo, supongo que seguramente ya lo conoce, pero si no, avanzar sobre el concepto de democracia cuidadora, justamente que desarrolla Tronto, Joan Tronto, una de las que ha iniciado este campo de estudio y que ha estado por aquí, por Colombia, en varias oportunidades. Y sí, por supuesto, democracias cuidadoras parece ser absolutamente central. Ahora, el hecho de plantearlo en ese nivel, no nos olvidemos que también la democracia justamente pasa por la democratización de la vida cotidiana y del vínculo cotidiano. Esa es la esencia para construir realmente sistemas democráticos fuertes, potentes y consolidados en nuestra región. No es solamente mirando este nivel de agregación, sino empezando a trabajar, como decíamos en el comentario anterior, a partir de esa noción de politizar la vida cotidiana, introducir la cuestión democrática, las relaciones democráticas en nuestra vida cotidiana, que vamos a poder trabajar hacia esas democracias cuidadoras.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. ¿Se oye? Sí, sí gracias. He estado tratando de pensar con
I'm
mucho
trying to
cuidado.
think carefully on the question. I haven't really made contest the question. I would like to know. It's more an insight in my head. No, it's not really my point of view. I come from philosophy, so my point of view is the concept or the terms itself. I can talk about the politics of I care. Care and I care is different. For example, the division of labor is I care. What is the relationship of that? I take care of kids, I take care of the elderly, and that's a difference of ethics of care. I would like to take care of, of that because the ethics of care has to do with the ethics of virtue. Care, there is a synchronicity in sense and practice in relationship with ethics. It has to do with virtue. So, how does the ethic of virtue would be different? And the second reflection is in the ethics of virtue. Well, ethics is a question. Is related to action, good action. Ethics of care is an answer to the questions. So, how should I do it? And why do I do it? And how should I do it? I think I'm clear up to this point. What we should do, an extension of the ethics of virtue in the interrelationships in the society among individuals and institutions. Very well. What do we mean when we talk about the virtue of care? I think we're talking about two things. In English, when we talk about accuracy, when we mention it for care, has to do with accurare. It means love, but it's also precision. The virtue of care has to do with precision. It's a virtue that has two elements. Do you agree with that second element of care that has not directly has to do with the way we understand care, like I take care of? When I care about the cat, I really care about the cat. Um, I take care of what I do, and I'm careful of what I do. It's an ethic of precise actions. Like to think, there has to be precise too. So it's a demand. My question is because I've not seen it in the ethics of care. And when we talk about division of labor, can we have a society in the market, not only the capitalistic market, in which we can
de cuidado.
function with an
Por
ethics
tanto,
of care.
es mejor no tratar de caducar los sistemas, porque imagínense el tiempo que necesitamos para
Can
hacer
you
un sistema
imagine the amount of time they have to
correctamente funcional.
invest
Mejor
to
hagamos
create a
otra cosa
system?
que tiene que ver con la posibilidad
How
de
about
vivir
to
en
create the
paz y
possibility
o un acercamiento al
or
sistema
or
donde no
system that
haya
has to do
sanciones.
with
Y ahí es donde se
the
corta
fact
la
of
vida.
living?
Gracias.
There lies the ethics of virtue.
Sin duda muy interesante tu reflexión.
Very interesting, your reflection.
A ver, algunos puntos, cuidado, cuido.
Like
Bueno,
I care, I
puede
take
ser
care,
buscar
care. I think
precisión
we have
nomás
to look
en las
for
palabras. En realidad lo
precise words,
que
but
se han usado
in fact, what has
en
been
la
used
práctica, no digo a
in
nivel concejal, en la
practice,
práctica se han
not
usado
in the
estos
concepts,
sinónimos.
they're
Pensar de
synonyms
repente
to
cuido, que
think,
se le llaman en Costa Rica,
let's
que lo
say,
hicieron para
the
personas
network
mayores
of care
dependientes,
that are for
porque
elderly
es un
applied in
sinónimo
Costa Rica
de
would be
cuidado.
a
Y lo
synonym
mismo
of
nos
care.
pasa en español,
And not
también en
only
muchos
happens in
idiomas.
Spanish and
Entonces,
other
bueno,
languages
por
too.
ahí podríamos entrar, pero creo que no es la parte más
I
interesante de tu
think
pregunta,
um,
sino más lo vinculado a la
your
ética del
question is
cuidado,
much more
a
linked
la
to the
virtud
ethics of
del
care
cuidado.
or the virtue of care.
Podría decir que estoy de acuerdo
I could
contigo,
say that I do
salvo por
agree
un
with
pequeño
you,
matiz. Me gustaría tener un
but
poquito de
I
cuidado
would
o
like
de
to take a
atención
little bit, I
con
would like to have a little bit
la esencia
of
femenina
care with
asociada a lo que tú
the
planteaste.
feminine
La virtud
essence,
del
the
cuidado
virtue
o
of
la ética
care,
del
with
cuidado
the
así
ethics of
planteada
care,
está muy asociado
is
a
highly
planteos
associated
esencialistas
to
femeninos, o sea, quienes
feminist
tenemos la virtud del
ideas.
cuidado,
Who
quienes tenemos el don,
have the
dicen
virtue of
algunas autoras
care?
filósofas como tú
Some
que han trabajado en este tema,
many
yo vengo del
philosophers
campo de la
have
sociología,
worked on that. I come from the
quienes tenemos el
sociology,
don
who have
del cuidado somos las mujeres y
uh,
quienes no tienen ese don
the
son los
capacity
varones.
of care,
Obviamente,
of being
criticando esa
caregivers.
postura que remite una vez más a lo de la división
That
sexual
leads
del
us
trabajo, el
again to
proceso
the
de
sexual
precarización
division
y
of
etcétera,
labor,
etcétera.
etc., etc.
Entonces yo tendría un poquito de
So I
cuidado
would be
con ese
careful
manejo,
with
por
managing
esta
that
crítica o
concepts
por
due
esta
to
cuestión de
the
esencialismo femenino
that
que en definitiva
feminine
está en la base de los procesos de
foundations that is in the
naturalización.
basis
Y eso
of
es lo que después en la
naturalization. These
naturalización
naturalization processes
feministas queremos
are
deconstruir
the
y queremos
ones that
cambiar, ¿sí?
feminists
No
want to
solo
build
deconstruir.
and
Eso
change.
primera cuestión.
So that would be the first
Después,
part of your question. On the other hand,
sobre los actos precisos,
on the
siendo que no,
precise
no es el
acts,
ejemplo del gato, pero
that would
podemos
be, for
llevarlo a las
example,
personas,
of the
¿no?
cat. We can
También a los
just
animales,
talk
no
about
humanos, pero
other
podemos poner
animals
personas en el
or
centro sin problema.
individuals.
Sí, claro que se necesitan actos precisos
We
en
need
la cuestión del
precise
cuidado, ¿verdad? No es
actions
solamente
in care.
una cuestión así en general. Por
It's
eso
not
yo llamé
only in
esa
general.
dimensión
That's why
material,
I
¿sí?
talked
Es
about that
un
material
cuidado que implica
dimension at
el
the beginning
trabajo, las
that
actividades,
implies
el cuidado de un
care,
niño, de una niña,
taking care of a
bueno,
child.
¿qué implica el
What
cuidado?
does
Implica
the
darle
care
de comer.
imply?
Es un
We have
acto
to
de
feed them.
precisión,
That
no
is
es
a
cualquier cosa darle
precision.
de comer a un niño, una
That is
niña
an
y
act, a
pensarlo, o sea, hay
precise act,
toda esa cuestión de los actos precisos
precise acts involved.
que si no se hacen,
That if
por ejemplo, en el caso
we
de la
don't do them,
niñez,
for
ponen
example,
en
with the
riesgo la
children,
existencia misma
they
del sujeto,
place
¿no?
the
Del niño o de
children
un
at
niño en este
risk.
caso. Entonces, vaya si eso se necesita.
So we need that precise actions.
El tema es quién lo hace y
Now,
cómo se hace
who
y por qué
does
asumir una
that
vez más
process
esa
of care?
esencia femenina
And
del
why do
cuidado
we have
que
to
también
assume it
presenta en todas las
as
representaciones sociales,
a
en todos sus
feminine
formas.
figure?
¿Sí? Cuando tú empezás
When
a
you
estudiar e indagar en torno a
begin
esas
to
representaciones
study around
sociales,
those
simbólicas, etcétera,
social
esto de lo
representations,
femenino aparece muy
the
fuerte.
feminine aspect generally is stronger.
Hay varias, por ejemplo, varios estudios que
There are
muestran,
several
si me
studies
voy al
that
otro
show
extremo de la
that
población,
if I
a las
go
personas mayores
and
dependientes,
see those
¿sí? Cuando se les
dependent
pregunta
elderly
los
people
cuidados que
when
necesitan,
asked
cómo quieren que
for the
sean
care
brindados,
they
dejando de
need,
lado los
just
cuidados
leaving
muy
aside the
específicos,
specific
médicos o de la
medical
enfermería
care
que
or
requieren
the
otro tipo
nurses that they need,
de precisión para usar tus categorías y de conocimiento, siempre lo plantean
they
a
always
que lo
say,
cuide una mujer.
I
Yo
want to be
quiero que
taken
cuide,
care
porque
by a
se
woman
asocia a esa
because
esencia
that
o a ese
essence
don
is
del cuidado que
associated, that
supuestamente solo las
gift
mujeres
is
deben tener
associated
los
with
varones.
women,
Con
and
eso
that
hay que
men do
tener
not have.
mucho
So we have
cuidado,
to be very,
¿sí?
very careful.
Y después lo que tú decías sobre el final de tu
And
intervención sobre
at
la
the
cuestión
end,
del
you were
mercado.
mentioning the market.
A ver, yo no estoy planteando planteando que colocar el cuidado en el
I'm not
centro
saying
necesariamente
that to
implica
put
derrotar el sistema
care
capitalista. Lo
in the
podemos
center,
hacer,
it would be
digamos,
just to
con gastos
completely break
como
out
prioría, pero no como prioridad. Digamos, estamos planteando
the,
soluciones
the,
en
the,
el
the,
marco de este
the,
sistema
the
capitalista,
system
es
that we
el
have
sistema
today.
capitalista
It's the
en todos los
capitalist
países. Pero ¿qué queremos?
system that
Construir
is embedded in our
dentro
countries.
también
But
las sociedades de mercado
also
que hoy nos
in the
rigen,
societal
cuestiones
markets,
que
we need
revaloricen el
for
cuidado,
them to
recoloquen los cuidados
reevaluate
individuales o de la misma
the
institución, que
concept of
también
care
de parte anterior la misma, pero con la cuestión del cuidado como una
as
dimensión
a
normativa.
very important dimension.
Y eso quiere decir que hasta que no,
This means
perdón
that
porque lo voy a simplificar, ¿verdad? Pero que hasta que no destruyamos el
until we do
capitalismo,
not
entonces no
destroy
podremos preocuparnos
capitalism,
del
we
cuidado o
cannot
de
we
colocar
cannot
el
worry
cuidado como una
about
dimensión
care
principal,
as
no
a
para nada.
focal
Tenemos
dimension.
que
No, we
buscar
have to seek
alternativas
different alternatives
que para mí pasan
that,
por entender el
for
cuidado como
me,
un pilar del
are
bienestar y del
moreover
desarrollo
than just
social,
thinking about care
los marcos
as a
que
pillar.
tenemos
We have
y que
to
hagan
have these
factibles las
frameworks
transformaciones
that lead
mientras,
to important
ojalá, se
transformation
producen otras de carácter
until
más estructural.
we
No
have
sé si fui clara,
structural transformations.
pero bien, por ahí.
I don't know if I was clear enough. Thank you very much.
Sí, sí, ya. Muchísimas gracias. Creo que es
So much.
una ponencia muy importante
I think it was a very
y el trabajo
important presentation.
ha sido muy
Está cansado.
Gracias. Ya, entonces hay muchos vínculos
So
también
there are a lot of connections with the previous discussion that we had,
quiero que mañana en adelante
and that it was really in sync to this with this agenda and the importance of this subject, especially in this region in Latin America.
pero también me parece importante
Also, I think it is important to point out and to decipher the semantics and of the possibly different meanings that care could have, because there's an important idea of the genealogy of the note of the notion historically seen as for its use in the different languages.
ahí voy. Primero quiero preguntar cómo está
And first, I wanted to ask you, how have you defined care in the surveys you mentioned? And second, I asked this because
digamos toda esa idea
in this whole idea of care started in a context in the United States where we didn't really have this social state of protection that allows the institutionalization of care. And
digamos hay una cara
there is this criticism that comes from countries like France, where there's not a good translation of this word that says, well, care
rellenando un
is
vacío
kind of filling a gap of the state,
aportaría mucho
and this could contribute to this neoliberal reading of things, of how to redistribute things among individuals, how to redistribute this care that doesn't come from the state. And there's this criticism around this topic of how, and I think there's an issue of understanding care in different ways, which needs a theoretical, additional theoretical work, maybe analyzing other categories such as self-care. And as you said, so sex, gender distribution of labor, and like different ways of taking care of which also has to do with the person who spoke before me, not only care as we understand it, but also to being careful and being respectful towards others and preserve others. Well, there's missing some words for the comprehension of this context and the use of this in other languages. I would be interested in listening to you. Some people say, well, care is just filling these gaps, and maybe this contributes. It would be contributing to more neo liberal patterns,
En Francia, por ejemplo, existen todos estos
because maybe in France today there are so many
mujeres
networks of women
con bajo
all
ese lema.
promoted in the private sector with this idea of care, under this idea of care. So maybe that's something interesting for me. Yes, without a doubt, there's this whole discussion behind the word care in Spanish and in other languages as well. What's important in Latin America, I'm interested in topic is very closely related. Well, the first thing was the survey. So as for the survey, what we did was we mentioned the time that we have been working with DANE, the Statistics Institution in Colombia. So we applied a specific measurement on the non-paid activities of care that takes place in the household, domestic activities, taking care of children, elders, etc. And we did this comparison of the last measuring that we did in the case of Colombia had been in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, on time use. Yes, it was 2017.
Se aplicó ahora
And this was applied with ONU women, with UN women, to see what happened during the pandemic with those tasks that had been measured in 2017. And we compared that data. And that's why we said that women are adding 1 more hour to their care activities. And you can look it up on the internet as well. And there are different genealogies. And I think in Latin America, there are two main characteristics that are quite um, inherent to the region. And as it usually happens with the literature that comes from all over the region, and then you have a synthesis. So the main thing is that care in reality, and we've been studying this for a long time, was imposed as an object of research from the logic of non-paid work. It is from that place. So we had been working, myself and another and a whole network of researchers in Latin America. We were working more about the productive and reproductive work, and then the relationship between paid and unpaid work and its components through time measuring and other measures when measurements when we start seeing some specific elements with particular characteristics that were not the same as other components of paid work, such as volunteer work, for instance, and that was in sync with discussions around the word care, but not from the United States. It came especially from Europe, from the Anglo side of Europe, and also the Nordic ideas of care, also taking into account the French literature. However, they don't really develop a word for the concept of care in French. They use the word in English, care. I actually studied in France in the team who's working on this topic, which was 20 years ago. That's what happened. But in Latin America, we have this preoccupation about was the unpaid work, and from that discussion that it is imposed due to differential characteristics. So the reproductive aspects, such as chores, basically, and the non-paid work. So that was our starting point. This associated to our discussion on well-being. in Latin America, we have well-being, kind of broken well-being societies. We could behave differently, or we call this incomplete well-being. And there, I don't really agree with you in the fact that this is not from the logic of uh, giving more arguments, neoliberal arguments, but actually is the opposite for me, is actually by showing the need of developing social models or social states that face this component of care as a part of their duties and responsibilities, in not following the American model as the answer, and not as a part of the feminist movement. And that care is also should also be a part of the feminist group. So I think that's how I would enter in this discussion, at least here in this region. I'm pretty sure there are other elements that I don't know about, that I don't participate in other places. Then about academic networks in Latin America, they have that approach, and I think they have a very more active conversation with the European literature than with American literature. Because what we know and recognize that American literature has another notion, another vision of care that have to do with the question that was mentioned, that was asked before, on ethics of care and the essentialism, quote unquote, feminine essentialism. And this comes more from the American side of literature. Thank you, Karina. I think we're going to close this panel by thanking you for this wonderful conversation. Obviously, this category of care triggers within the category of development, trigger a lot of very interesting things for our debates that will take place still tomorrow. We'll have a lot of things to talk about still. So thank you so much for being here, and see you tomorrow.